post-exercise, the uptake of glycogen into the muscles is much more effective. So from a recovery standpoint and replenishing, your muscle glycogen stores, that happens more efficiently post-exercise. However, it also, from a weight loss perspective, it also helps satiety later in the day. So as an example, if you weren't to eat immediately post-training or within that sort of first hour of training, depending on the intensity of the session, of course, but that may then cause you to eat more later in the day because you're potentially craving energy. And generally when we're starting to fatigue and start to crave, energy, we're generally going to, opt for higher sugar and refined carbohydrate foods, which are typically going to be higher in calories. So from a weight loss perspective, we're adding in high calorie foods later in the day away from exercise, whereas it's going to be much more effective to add it in post-training to support appetite later in the day, and then obviously support the recovery benefits from the muscles as well.
So will this have a big impact with speeding up the recovery process? It
really depends on your next training session and the intensity as well. So if you've got another training session within the next 8 to 12 hours, so if you're training, twice in one day, for example, or if you're training late afternoon, evening one day, and then early morning the next day, then yes, it will have a great benefit to include a post-training snack or post-train meal quite quickly that's high in carbohydrates. If, for example, you've got a recovery session or, you've got another 24 hours till the next session, so you only train that once a day, you're generally going to get in enough sort of carbohydrates over that day if you're eating balanced. But it also depends on the types of carbohydrates that you're opting to eat later in the day as well. Something that's also be mindful of is, often post-exercise, particularly when people are trying to lose weight, it's really easy to fall into the trap of feeling good post-exercise, being motivated, feeling like you're on the weight loss bandwagon. So people often use that motivation to then restrict food because they're motivated to do so. Now, the danger of that is, as I said before, you might then crave high sugar foods later in the day because you're going to be in somewhat of a deficit after a training session, or it's likely you'll be in a deficit after a training session. So if we're using that deficit at that training time, it is natural that eventually, if you restrict long enough, that is going to sort of bounce back and you're going to have somewhat of a rebound effect and crave high sugar foods later in the day. So I guess I usually talk clients through and athletes through that fueling and recovering around training, even during a weight loss period, is going to be beneficial to overall energy intake in the day because, as I said, muscles can uptake carbohydrates more effectively at that sort of 1 hour post-training window. But also from a satiety point of view, it's going to support reducing sugar cravings later down the track, whether that's that afternoon, that night, potentially even the next day. And it makes it a lot easier to choose healthier foods later in the day if you're able to recover within that sort of first hour of training.
How should people be incorporating high carb meals around a busy life schedule? Say they're training in the morning and then straight away they're going to go to work, don't have much time to cook up a full meal. Should they be doing? This
is really common, particularly for people who train in the morning and then do have a busy schedule, so they need to go to work or drop the kids to school and things like that. And it's really common for people to just grab something on the go. So they might just get a protein shake, or they might grab a piece of toast or a piece of fruit. Some people might even skip breakfast until they've got time. So we've spoken about the benefits of why it's important to eat post-training, but some really quick and easy ideas that I often sort of recommend to clients would be, overnight oats. So something you can make up the night before. So, in an oat base, using a milk and yogurt as a protein source. And again, there's other options for that as well. Adding some fruit to it and then some nuts and seeds. And then we're kind of incorporating a really good recovery meal, ticking off sort of the macronutrient that the body requires from a recovery point of view. But also helping with satiety and sort of energy levels over the day. Because often what happens is then people try to go to work or study or whatever it might be that they're doing, and their brain's not necessarily entirely functioning properly because they're in too much of a deficit post-training. They're also, muscles aren't recovering properly as well. Another really good option would be something like a quiche or a homemade sort of frittata with eggs and veggies, and then using a carbohydrate source on top of that. So whether they just quickly heat that in the microwave and pop it into a wrap. So again, it's like a breakfast burrito. That's a really easy, quick option. And then smoothies is another great option as well. So chucking it all in the blender, making sure we're getting the protein, the carbs, some fruit or some veggies in there depending on the type of smoothie, and some sort of healthy anti-inflammatory fat. Really easy way. Worst case scenario, you'll kind of pair a couple of different snacks together. So, grab a yogurt or a protein shake, grab a piece of fruit and, a handful of nuts. Still not going to be necessarily enough for most people who are training at higher levels, but it might at least kickstart that recovery, and then trying to eat a main meal sort of over the next couple of hours.
So really just preparation on planning out your training week and making sure you have food like in the fridge ready to go.
That's a big one, is people often don't do a proper grocery shop. It's sort of planning one day at a time, and often that doesn't allow for a training schedule and a busy lifestyle. So looking at your week, looking at what sessions you've got coming up, planning out meals where you can. And again, I'm all for having a little bit of flexibility and intuitive eating, but first and foremost, have the food available to you so you're not getting takeaways or drive-throughs or picking stuff up from the service stations all the time.
So how does carbohydrates post-exercise support your metabolic function?
By incorporating some carbohydrates in the post-training meal, what we're doing is helping support the muscle recovery. So often it's thought that protein is the only thing that's beneficial for muscle growth and muscle recovery, but carbohydrates, in my opinion, is just as important. So if we're replenishing the glycogen stores post-training, we're supporting the recovery and likely the building of those muscle fibers. Now, we know that if we've got more muscle, we've got more metabolic tissue, more metabolically active tissue. So it's going to impact or improve your metabolism over time if we're supporting that muscle growth. So in a nutshell, adding carbohydrates to a post-training meal will help support building lean mass and strength, which will then also improve metabolic function and metabolism overall.
So alternatively, if you're not replenishing post-exercise with carbohydrates, you're theoretically losing out on muscle gains.
Possibly, yeah, absolutely, because it really depends on the total amount of carbohydrates eaten over the day and the protein and your overall calorie consumption. There's lots to metabolism and muscle recovery, but generally post-training is going to be optimized in that sort of 1 hour window.